Okay, well, welcome everybody to another CFCI webinar. The webinar today is on the Cambridge nuclear bunker. Our speaker is Michael Vanoli from AMA Chartered Architects. So Michael's going to give us his presentation today, which is a video of the project. Part of the team also was obviously the Cambridge University Estate Management, Aecom, Roger Parker Associates and RG Carter. I think they are in the audience, I've been told, so when we have our Q&A session at the end, I might even try to be really whizzy and try and bring them into the Q&A, but that might not work, so you'll have to bear with me. So so that reminds me, if during the presentation you have any questions and answers, please do raise them in either the chat box or the Q&A box. And look at that, already we've got, yeah, the question: is this being recorded? Yes, it is. Apparently someone needs to leave early to take a Zoom call. There you go. So anyway, right, so yes, let's keep on track. If you do have any questions you want to raise for Michael at the end of his talk, please do so in the Q&A or the chat bar, and then I will put those questions to Michael, and we will try our best to answer them. So, okay, right. Michael, are you good to go? Shall I stop sharing screen and let you kick off?
Please.
Excellent. Okay,
great, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. The presentation, I'll try and cover as much as I possibly can, picking up both the historic context of the building, some of the feasibility studies and case studies that were carried out on it, plus also the current project that was recently completed, recent works. Perhaps once relaxations do come in, there'll be an opportunity to visit the site proper at some stage. It is worth having a look and walk around, but that's obviously for the university to confirm acceptance. And as Simon said, once complete, I'm very happy to take questions. So I'm going to stop my video and then put on the share screen for you to watch. Thank you very much.
The Cambridge bunker is an early 1950s two-storey surface type Grade 2 listed structure war room with a 1960s addition providing the regional seat of government, or RSG, and constructed to house the variety of ministries found on the previous government estate off Brooklands Avenue. The function of this building was reflected in its internal arrangements, providing physical protection of the commissioner and his staff, receipt of the filtering of information about the condition of the region, and in this instance it's Cambridge, regional seat of government number 4, after a nuclear attack, and of course the dissemination of decisions. In the late 1950s, with the greater threat posed by the Soviet H-bomb, the earlier system of emergency central government was restructured. In place of the smaller war rooms, the commissioners in each region were supplied with a regional seat of government for around 200 staff. Although they all vary, all buildings or structures were provided with thick external walls to resist blast, heat and radiation penetration. They were all equipped with air filtration plant, standby generators, canteens, dormitories, operation rooms, communication facilities and support areas. Their large size is significant, as it was envisaged that the regions would need to remain autonomous for a long period due to their far greater devastation posed by the H-bomb. The designers recognised that no structure could withstand the full effects of an H-bomb and were primarily concerned instead to protect their staff against the effects of fallout. 9 regional seats of government were constructed in England. Of these, Cambridge and Nottingham were the only purpose-built examples. The changes in threat and the perception of it affected the architecture of the buildings. There were 3 types of structure used for the purpose-built 1950s war rooms: surface single-storey buildings, predominantly used in London, semi-sunken 2-storey and surface 2-storey buildings, which Cambridge falls under. The exterior to the regional seat of government presents a definably brutalist appearance, relatively unpunctuated by openings and relieved only by formed concrete hoods to the external duct openings. The elevations have formed concrete, washed gravel and plain alternating panels, the latter being subtly decorated through the use of timber shuttering. The main roofs, predominantly flat, are covered with a traditional asphalt roof membrane or overlaid with mineral felt, and there seems to be what appears to be old transmitter antennae points located in each corner, although they no longer exist. Intrinsically then, as a Grade 2 listed building, the bunker is considered to be of high heritage significance. However, the bunker is the fusion of two buildings, the 1950s War Room and the 1960s RSG, the latter of lesser importance. The existing schematic plans used in this presentation are taken from Wayne Crocroft's book, The Cold War. They indicate the allocated room functions during its period of intended use, 1947 to 1991. In general, it is planned with a central map room surrounded by control cabins, offices and plant room. On its southeast elevation, it connects to the much larger RSG, whose interior is subdivided into plant rooms and offices on the ground floor and dormitories above. The 1950s building is 2 stories and entered at ground floor level to the northwest, and we presume to the southeast via steps to the rear, both with massive metal blast doors. The plan revolved around the central double height map room with control rooms and perspex screens looking into it. The design of the War Room therefore bears similar resemblance to those used in World War II, but significantly enhanced to ensure it would withstand the overwhelming effects posed by an atomic blast and predominantly the fallout. Consequently, the structure is constructed from reinforced concrete walls and roof. The threat of an atomic bomb meant that the outer walls were 4 foot 10 inches thick, with a 5 foot thick roof, all reinforced concrete. These massive walls were designed to give the occupants of the bunker a protection factor of 400. In other words, 400 times greater protection and radiation than the person outside. Only the toilets have brick walls. All the other internal walls, again, reinforced concrete. The plant room is at the east side of the ground floor and had an air filtration system supplied by Matthews and Yates of Swinton in Manchester, dating from 1953, which still survives. Metal air conditioning ducts were fitted to the ceilings, and an element of the existing plant still remains. This would have provided heat and ventilation to its hapless occupants. However, over the years this has sadly been either removed due to the presence of ACMs or due to theft as a result of break-ins. The detonation of the Soviet H-bomb in August 1953 meant that the war rooms were largely obsolete, virtually from the moment they were finished. The Soviet Union had demonstrated that it now had the power to wipe out whole cities and the surrounding transport and communication networks. This meant that the regional control centres would need to be larger and house more people for longer periods, as the post-explosion recovery period would be longer. Consequently, a system of regional seats of government, RSGs, were then planned. The purpose of the new RSGs changed that from the war rooms. The onus was no longer about protecting the staff inside, but about bringing help and relief to the surviving public. As a result, the RSG staff included personnel from various government ministries, public information distribution, including the BBC, police, fire, civil defence and communications. Notices from January 1966 suggested that the Cambridge RSG could house 400 people, 120 of them female. For those that have visited the bunker will know that the psychological mental impact of being housed within this structure would have been immense. The need to house more staff meant that a new larger 2-storey structure was effectively adjoined to the south side of the old war room. The new building was still 2 stories but had thinner walls, as there would be no adequate protection against the force of the blast and a resultant heat. Its purpose purely was to protect the occupants from fallout, if they survived. As previously stated, the 1960s building was largely used for offices and control rooms of the various departments on the ground floor, again with plant on the east end, and with the dormitories and catering on the upper floor. The exception was the offices of the various ministries which occupy the southwest end of the upper floor. Male dormitories and recreation room were to the north of the spine corridor, female dormitories and kitchen/dining area to the south. In the early 21st century, around the time when the building was listed, there was a great deal of discussion around whether the building should be demolished. Applications were submitted for demolition in 2003 and 2004, and the latter was actually resolved to be approved by the city's planning committee against the recommendation of officers that no proper efforts had been made to seek a new use for the building. However, and thankfully, the decision was called in by the Secretary of State, and subsequently the applicant withdrew the application. All good news. In 2006, the City Council approved a scheme for the use of the building for archive and data storage, B8, with ancillary A1 office use. The parallel listed building consent application proposed the creation of a completely new wide entrance in the south elevation of the RSG, the removal of all the partitions on the ground floor except those which formed the former plant rooms on the east side of the building, and the complete removal of all the partitions on the first floor except those around the stair cores. A goods lift was also proposed adjacent to the new entrance doors. This now brings us up to our appointment, 2013. This is when the University of Cambridge submitted a feasibility study to their Buildings Committee for the review and approval with regard to a proposal to use the 1960s bunker as a storage facility for use by both the Cambridge University Library and the Museum of Anthropology and Archaeology. The committee subsequently requested an additional level of development to be reported with a greater detailed costing before the scheme could actually go and be considered further. The principle of the design brief was to provide specific storage space on both the ground and first floors of the 1960s RSG, utilising static and mobile shelving, along with specialised units to support and store unique pieces and deliver associated spaces in support of the day-to-day running and operation of the facility for use by the Museum of Anthropology and Archaeology. The storage requirements accommodated within the 1960s building was established through a thorough survey carried out by Rackline. This involved a number of visits to the current storage facilities, where materials held by the Museum of Anthropology and Archaeology, and taking detailed measurements of each individual or group of artefacts, of which there are absolutely thousands, ensuring that all items are accounted for within the shelving proposals. What is worthy of mention is that the ground floor currently has 1.3 kilometres of shelving. This excludes the cantilever arm racking and some of the A-framing, where we just cannot quantify the linear rate. And then on the first floor we have 1.7 kilometres of shelving, plus a further 700 square metres of hanging mesh storage. So there's nearly 3 kilometres of shelving installed within this building. Upon entering the building, you're introduced to the main lobby, where most of the artefacts will find its place once being delivered onto site. To the right hand side is a workroom. To the left hand side, the new plant room. And the double doors ahead relate to going into the ground floor up to the actual storage area. In terms of the structure, with advice being provided by Peter Dan Limited, little structural intervention was carried out except for the removal of the inner spine walls, none of which were load bearing. With the proposed use of the structure being for storage, the capacity of the first floor slab did not accord with this, unfortunately. The loading is therefore limited on the first floor by the format of the installed fixed shelving. As such, limitations on the shelving ensure that any overstacking loading is prevented and is kept within capacity. A new lift and stair void was created against an external wall and trimmed with new steel beams supported on posts down onto the ground floor slab. The ground floor was raised slightly within the entrance area to accommodate the new depth required to form the lift pit. The existing external concrete facade was in good condition and showed very little sign of spalling, nor are there any areas of exposed reinforcement or staining. The roofs, however, asphalt and mineral felt finishes were in a very poor condition, particularly the mineral felt to parapet situations on the rooftop tank room structure. A new insulated warm roof build-up was installed, providing an additional line of waterproofing and also an increased level of thermal improvement that was originally lacking. In terms of external works, an area directly adjacent the east elevation was hard landscaped to provide adequate access for deliveries plus parking for a couple of vehicles along with sufficient cycle spaces. The existing chestnut tree and grassed area beneath it was retained, and for a limited numbers of staff working within the building, a picnic style bench within this area provides an amenity space when weather allows. Existing concrete paths surrounding the perimeter of the building also remained untouched. A new 2.4 metre high welded mesh fencing panel with strong anti-climb design was erected around the north and east boundaries, incorporating a 4 metre wide vehicular and 1 metre wide pedestrian gate for access onto the site. Due to the extreme sensitivity of the materials being stored within the building, the exact environmental conditions were defined very early on, with current temperature ranges between 16 to 24 centigrade within a maximum variation not exceeding 4 centigrade in any 24-hour period. Also, in terms of relative humidity, this was set between 35 to 60% RH, with variation not to exceed 10% with any 24-hour period. So as you can see, very tight parameters. One benefit of the 500mm thick walls with few openings meant that the air permeability rate of 1 metre cubed per hour per metre squared at 50 pascals could be achieved. However, we felt that to safeguard this, a specialist air sealing paint should be applied to the internal face of all the external concrete faces of walls to ensure that air permeability of below 1 could be achieved and obtained. The thermal modelling indicate an extremely low heating and dehumidification requirement, which introduced the need for only a small amount of heating cooling, and as such an air source heat pump as a heat source was deemed sensible. This has been installed in a suitable location to the rear of the building, both to allow maintenance access and air movement. I'm now wanting to talk about the fire strategy, and in particular the importance of preserving the artefacts within the building. Originally, a water-based sprinkler system was considered the most cost-efficient, taking into account the level of protection required. However, upon lengthy discussions and assessment with the museum and with the university, it was decided that an alternative option be considered: gas suppression. It was felt that this was more appropriate for the application, considering the number of spaces it would serve to protect, cost benefits that could be achieved, and weighing up the damage limitation to artefacts if a fire were to be experienced. An inert gas suppression system extinguishes fire by reducing the ambient oxygen concentration to below the level required to support combustion. The current gas concentration should be achieved to maintain safe levels of oxygen for respiration. The greenhouse effect of the nitrogen, Ig 100, and ozone layer depletion potential is zero. Nitrogen is inert, non-conductive, colourless, odourless and flavourless. The inert gas is also non-corrosive and can be used at ambient temperatures with the various materials being stored. The existing basement within the building, originally used for water tanks and oil tanks, have been now stripped out, and this is where we've got the gas cylinders stored that provide the inert gas to supply the fire strategy system. Handover. Practical completion was successfully achieved in September 2020 after an approximate construction period of 12 months. The museum are now left with the daunting task of decanting from their current facility into the 1960s building, albeit slowly, to ensure that the internal environment is maintained as those new artefacts are brought in from one space to another. To conclude, the Cambridge Bunker is a virtually unique heritage asset. This is partly because it's one of the most tangible pieces of architecture of the Cold War period, but also because the building was never used for its original purpose, and indeed has never had any other use until now. The decision to list the building in 2003 rather than designate it a scheduled ancient monument could be taken as acceptance that the building warranted being put to new use, rather than simply being preserved as a monument for its own sake. Even nuclear buildings deteriorate over time, and the building's future has now been safeguarded with its storage facility.
Right.
Super. Michael, that was fascinating. Thank you very much. Wow. I must admit, you sort of forget. So having been born in the 60s and growing up during the Cold War, it was it's something that I think people of my generation remember very well, and the threat level, if that's the right word, was for some of us as children quite nerve-wracking. And it's interesting to see what was built in Cambridge, and probably very few of us had any idea at the time of this. But anyway, super presentation. Thank you very much. So why don't we have a look at some of the questions that have come in as we've been listening to your presentation. So I think one of the first questions for you, Michael, is it just the 60s building that's being used? What's happening to the 50s building?
Actually, the 50s building came in through a later stage within the project, and consideration has been given for long-term storage in the 50s. But because there is, it's deemed as a greater heritage asset, obviously in terms of doing any internal works, we're not allowed. As such, if it is going to be used, it will be used in the cellular arrangement that the spaces are formed at the moment. One thing that was carried out was that there is going to be a fire escape, or there is a fire escape route from the 60s building that runs through the 1950s building and then outside. So there was a new fire alarm system that was installed within that. But at the moment, it's not being used. The only area that was developed as part of this project, of course, was the 1960s, or RSG.
Interesting, isn't it? I mean, you mentioned the fact of the 1950s element being more protected. And I think here we go. We've got a couple of questions. One from, oh, that's interesting. Somebody who was a former custodian of the building between 85 and 90. But before we go on to that question about potential visits, I guess that would, I wonder whether the university would be interested in the building becoming part of the open house. That's something perhaps we should take back to university in terms of, I think there's annual open house events, and I'm sure many people would be really interested.
The only difficulty with that, as you can appreciate, the internal environment, particularly of the storage areas, have to be maintained. And therefore, if they're opened up, as you can appreciate, any outside air contamination and also temperatures in RH or temperature is going to affect whatever's being stored inside. That's
a really good leader into the next question, actually. It's almost as though this is planned. So the moving in process, there's a question here about, well, where are the artifacts coming from? I suppose, where are they currently stored, and what's the process of moving them into the building? Have they already moved into the building? Are the shelves full?
Not yet, no.
Okay.
As said, you talked 3 kilometres of shelving. That's an awful lot of artefacts that need to be moved. In terms of facilities, there are a number in and around Cambridge that are used by the museum, and that's the purpose of it. Unfortunately, they are starting to degrade. They're not in the best of conditions, and as such, some of the artefacts are, I wouldn't say being affected by that, but could be affected by that. So it's a very slow process. The museum have already started their cataloguing process. That started towards the end of last year, and in terms of the transition, moving it from the current existing facilities into this one, on the last count they were talking about anything up to 3 years. So it's a very slow arrangement that's going to take place.
Right. Yes. Yeah. I mean, it's that conditioning process, isn't it? That's quite difficult.
It's also considering the objects, they can range from a roll of silk up to something that might be a totem pole or a canoe or something similar to that. So there is a great deal of thought needs to be given, and it's a specialist involvement that is taking place at the moment. No mean feast.
It's quite phenomenal, isn't it? I mean, if you work out 3 kilometres of shelving, I mean, that's equivalent to about 400 lorries, albeit obviously you'll bring more than, be able to get more than one shelf in a lorry. But anyway, I'm an engineer, I like my numbers. So anyway, hopefully not more than 400 lorries. So here's another question. This might be a bit unfair to put to you, but why wasn't solar paneling used on the roof? I mean, I think you'll find that's a bit mean to say that. I guess it could be in the future, but I don't think it was part of the scheme, was it?
It wasn't part of the scheme. It was considered.
Mm-hmm.
The scheme was actually under the university's design guide. There was a need for it to be assessed under BREEAM. Obviously, this is pretty unique in terms of refurbishment. Assessments were carried out. The difficulty is actually because, as I said within the presentation, the building was only designed to take into account the live and dead loads of people. We had problems in terms of getting the shelving required onto the first floor, but also actually the thickness of the slab or the roof slab on within the RSG building provided very limited opportunity to install the solar panels, and also limited very few opportunities in terms of getting access to carry out maintenance onto those solar panels, and that was one of the reasons why it was discounted.
Oh, right, interesting. You would have thought the roof would have been a fairly robust element, but obviously not.
Because of the spans, it wasn't.
Yeah,
because
interesting.
of the spans, it wasn't.
Fascinating. Here we go. So here's another one for you. Gosh, I've got a very curious audience today. Was there any occupancy at all, or was it just left empty with no staff? I'm assuming that's before you got hold of it. That's the question.
Yeah, as far as we understand, and certainly from the historic research that we've carried out, and it's worth mentioning that John Burgess was heavily involved in this. I don't know whether he's sitting within the audience at the moment, but no, it was never actually used. There was no one actually in or present within the building at all. Over a period of time, up until or prior to the purchase by the university, of course, it was used. It was used as a site accommodation by the developer on the Accordia site. That was, as far as I'm concerned, is the only time, or as far as the team is concerned, was the only time that was actually occupied.
Well, we do actually have in the audience, I won't give the name of the person, but there's somebody here who's got in touch saying, well, they were there from 85 to 90 as a custodian. I assume that might mean that they were actually in the building.
It'd be interesting to note. I think it was just a case of looking after the building rather than actually going in and being occupied or having an office set up in there. There are no windows in the building. In terms of, there's nothing. Well, as you would expect.
Yeah.
Windows are not blast proof. Well, they certainly didn't have the technology in the 1950s or the 1960s to have blast proof windows.
Right, interesting.
So in terms of the internal environment is concerned, the view is very limited.
So that's a good question. If there's no windows, is there anybody working full time in there now, or will there be?
Yes, there will be. The workroom itself, so the process in terms of bringing material in, it goes through a series of spaces and lobby arrangements. When it arrives, it has to be assessed. There is a transition period once it gets into the building. There's an area for fridges and for them to go through to ensure that nothing's being transferred from the old existing building in terms of parasites, infestation, that sort of thing, for when it then gets stored in the main storage area. Right. So there is going to be a limited number of people that will be working within that building. And when it comes to the workroom, lighting has been designed such that it gives them an element of well, it's not perfect. You're not going to have any daylight at all, but it's suitable for working in an enclosed space.
Right. Well, this is fascinating here. I'm getting a history lesson, but I'm also getting lots of people telling me this is fantastic. So we've got one person here. This is Alan. Let's call him Alan. So he was the custodian in the 80s. He's saying it was unoccupied most of the time, but visited about once a month by persons from London. We can't say their name, obviously, because if we do, they probably, no, we won't go there. Right, all secret.
And just to add to that, once the university took ownership, their facilities team would be carrying out, obviously, maintenance checks. They'll be carrying out inspections on a regular basis. Some of you may have seen a presentation or clip on BBC online by Steve Matthews. So he would be down visiting the site to ensure its safety and ensure what's going on there. So there was a series of makeshift fire alarms, lighting in there, so it could be checked and could be entered into.
Interesting. And we've also got Jim's telling us he heard it was in capital letters, by the way, was used as a comms centre in the first Gulf War. Can you deny or refute that?
No,
perhaps keep quiet.
Yeah.
Okay. Right, fascinating. I think it's one of those sessions where actually it would be good to open it up and let people tell their stories about the building. So we won't do that.
Before you do, Simon, there was one thing that I wanted to add in the presentation. I think it's once the RSG came on board or was built, and the way that the separation actually worked between the war room and the RSG itself, there was actually a padlock combination key between the two. So because the 1950s building was a safer building because of the density of the construction, even though there were officials and ministries housed in the 1960s, they then couldn't actually get into the 1950s at all. Wow. So, the psychological effect of that in itself was immense, I would imagine, knowing that you had colleagues working next door, but they were obviously in a far safer position than you because of the thickness of the walls. 1.5 metre thick concrete for the 1950s and 0.5 metre thick walls to the 1960s must have been how you would have slept in the dormitories at night. I don't know.
Interesting. Yes, the psychological impact of that being in the more protected environment and thinking about, that's
a
an
different
interesting
form of lockdown was experienced, I would suggest, it had that been the case.
Michael, there's another question here which you might help with. So here we go. Someone came in a bit late, but what if any of the original fixtures and fittings were retained within the building, and were there any interesting finds during the work? There you go.
In the 1960s, no. In terms of the strip out, as I said previously within the presentation, that was predominantly lightweight brickwork, the spine walls. There were a number of door labels or door titles that were kept, some of which you saw in the actual presentation itself, but nothing more than that. Prior to the works actually starting, and once ownership was taken over by the university, some of the most key items were stored and are in storage. Within the 1950s element, no, a certain amount of asbestos was stripped. That was part of the project, part of the enabling works that I should have mentioned. The only thing that I have found of any interest when I first visited it were a series of sort of Bakelite fixings, and even greaseproof toilet paper that had property of government stamped on the side of it. That also has been salvaged and is in storage somewhere, but there was nothing within the 60s. Dare I say it, prior to the ownership from the university, I think there was quite a lot of break-ins, and things were pilfered at that stage.
Right,
Exactly.
Interesting. There you go, you heard it here first. Grease-proof toilet paper brings back memories of primary school. Anyway, let's move on swiftly so talking of break-ins, actually, this is fascinating. So Roger, who apparently shared responsibility of custodial duties with Alan, is also listening today. Fantastic. And apparently he's had some interesting middle of the night call-outs with police and fire brigade involved. But there you go. So I guess that was the people trying to break in to have some fun inside there.
The huge metal doors that were present and are still present, certainly to the northwest end of the northeast end of the war rooms. They haven't been attacked, but there were a number of other doors around the RSG building itself that you can see there were, sort of have-a-go attacks to they didn't actually successfully get in at that stage.
Right. Interesting. Okay, so here's some more technical questions, which might be tricky to answer. But this one's on the air testing, the pressure testing. You mentioned what's the word? A performance requirement of 1. Was it actually tested?
It was tested, yeah, and we achieved 0.9.
0.9.
So we satisfactorily met what we were trying to achieve. So it was obviously helped by the new insulation and new roof. When it came to the external walls, they were actually lined out internally. So there was ply, insulation, metal studs. But as I said, there were a two-coat system that was used. Airtight paint that was used. As you would expect, the building being fairly sort of hermetically sealed as a consequence of the thickness of the walls, there were a certain amount of repairs that needed, particularly the junctions between the 1950 and the 1960s building, differential in movement, and there were cracks that had to be, concrete pairs that had to be carried out. Certainly when on first entering, when I first went in the building, 2012, there were a number of sort of stalactites, stalagmites as a result of water ingress coming through the through the roof at first floor level that percolated through. But that's the asphalt that had shifted on the roof and had bubbled up over a period of time, and water then got underneath that, and it's found its way through fissures and cracks within the roof structure.
Interesting. That probably raises a number of questions about insulation, doesn't it? I mean, you couldn't externally insulate, you didn't internally insulate, so you rely on the...
No, it wasn't. It was lined internally. So
it was lined internally.
200 mil thickness of insulation was lined to all of the internal faces of the external walls.
Right.
And then there was insulation that was applied, tapered insulation that was then applied on top of the existing roof.
Got you. So I guess there are some interesting cold bridging details, but that's all calculated into the
thermal model. Yeah.
Interesting, fascinating stuff. Alan's got back in touch about something about BT and something about a switchboard, perhaps. I'm not quite sure what that was involving, but there you go. So another technical question for you, and this might be from Paul. Is the nitrogen system a fire prevention system, or is it just used when a fire is detected to smother the fire?
It's purely to smother the fire. It's purely to protect the artifacts in the instance of a fire. It's a double knock system. So the fire alarm goes off. As everyone can appreciate, with a nitrogen system, it depletes the oxygen. So there is a first alarm that goes off, allows everyone to evacuate the building, the few numbers that are going to operate within the building, and then after, I think it's about 120 seconds to 2 minutes, depending on the severity of the fire, the nitrogen is then released at 50%, enough and sufficient then to suppress the fire, and obviously that continues.
Right, interesting.
And of course, that's also important in terms of the air tightness. You can't have air leakage when nitrogen's coming in, otherwise it's not going to do its job. You're going to have a backdraft arrangement, so that's important.
There you go. Sounds like the architect had to get quite involved in that. Thank you, Michael. So, that's interesting. Going back to the air testing, does the bunker operate at a positive air pressure?
It operates in terms of there is actually an air lock between the storage facility and when I say storage facility, this is at ground floor level, and then through to the lobby area. Okay,
good. I think we've actually got some people from residents associations nearby interested in the project and talking about visits, but you've mentioned already it's difficult, but sort of potentially such interest in the building, whether there could be some sort of signboard about the building and its history. But there you go, that's something for the...
I think you're going to be making available, is it just going to be to CFCI members, the actual video?
Yes, that's correct. Yeah.
Right, okay.
Yeah. But I mean, it's interesting, with all of these projects we do, I think every construction project, you could probably write a book on it, but this is particularly interested in in its history, I guess, as well. Let's just do one final question, because Michael, you're a bit on the spot here, aren't you? You've really been. It's let's take one more question, and we'll have to. I think we'll have to call it a day on that. So, can you please tell us about something fly roof, is that? And
Sorry,
the
which question
rainwater. So this is in the Q&A.
Oh,
Is
right,
there
okay.
is it? I'm assuming that might be butterfly roof. I don't know. Is there a butterfly roof? Oh, there. Oh, of course, yes. And the rainwater collection from this. Yeah.
There is a very small tank room that's not utilised, second floor, that sits on the line of the roof to the 1960s element. That has a butterfly roof on it. That was only repaired in terms of a new mineral felt arrangement or finish to it. And all in terms of rainwater runoff, we're using the existing rainwater pipes. It's not been increased or decreased in any sense.
Interesting.
There's no rainwater collection or harvesting on this building, if that was the question that was raised. So I'm just looking at the chats on the right hand side at the moment. I haven't seen any other questions raised.
There's a Q&A one as well, I think. And then there's a few questions about concrete, you know, whether it is reinforced or not.
Yes, it is reinforced. We did actually, in the background to me, there is a existing opening that was increased marginally to take into account some of the objects that were being transferred across. But that was cut back in the parameters of where the reinforcement was. So there was no reinforcement exposed at all.
Good. Okay.
The floor slabs are reinforced and the roof is reinforced.
Michael, that's wonderful. Thank you very much. We won't put you on the spot any longer. That was you've done very well. That's sort of 20 minutes of Q&A there, so well done. So it falls to me to say, Michael, thank you very much for that wonderful history lesson, but also
thank you for the
telling us about your project, and also thank you to the university for allowing the project to be shown, and also the design team members and the project team, I guess, overall involved.
I hope I've covered everyone.
Yeah, you know, it's absolutely fascinating. So it just falls to me just to give a couple of parish notices. In fact, only one parish notice, and that is that we have on Friday the 19th of March, our next webinar at 5 p.m, unusual time, but it's the Cambridge Construction and Design Awards virtual award ceremony. So the CFCI members will have received their email invites for that webinar, so keep an eye out for that. And yeah, please join us at the Friday 19th to have a look at that event. That'll be interesting. Good. Okay, Michael. Well, thanks once again, and I think we'll end it there. And thank you to Emma Fletcher, CFCI trustee, for organising all of this in the background. So super. Thank you, Emma. All right. Goodbye, everyone. Bye-bye.